Flatwoods Monster: A True Story from West Va. Skepticism, ridicule, and unwanted scrutiny. Some of the boys who had witnessed the creature found themselves the subject of teasing at school, while their families faced questions about their honesty and judgment. Mrs. Kathleen May, in particular, found herself in an uncomfortable position as the adult leader of the group that had encountered the creature. Some community members praised her courage in investigating a potential emergency situation, while others questioned her judgment in taking children into what proved to be a dangerous situation. "I did what I thought was right at the time," Mrs. May told reporter Gray Barker. "If I had believed for one moment that we were walking into danger, I would never have taken those children up that hill. But if someone had been hurt in a crash, waiting until morning might have been too late." The boys themselves handled the attention with varying degrees of comfort. Neil Nunley, as the oldest and most articulate of the group, often served as spokesperson for the others. He maintained consistently that they had told the truth about what they encountered, and refused to be swayed by those who suggested they had imagined or exaggerated the incident. "People can believe what they want," Neil told one reporter. "I know what I saw, and I know it wasn't any owl or any other normal animal. That thing was something that doesn't belong in these woods." Gene Lemon, as a volunteer firefighter and older teenager, faced particular scrutiny about his role in the incident. Some questioned why someone with emergency training hadn't attempted to get closer to the creature or investigate more thoroughly. "You have to understand," Gene explained. "When I saw that thing in the clearing, every instinct I Flatwoods Monster: A True Story from West Va. Skepticism, ridicule, and unwanted scrutiny. Some of the boys who had witnessed the creature found themselves the subject of teasing at school, while their families faced questions about their honesty and judgment. Mrs. Kathleen May, in particular, found herself in an uncomfortable position as the adult leader of the group that had encountered the creature. Some community members praised her courage in investigating a potential emergency situation, while others questioned her judgment in taking children into what proved to be a dangerous situation. "I did what I thought was right at the time," Mrs. May told reporter Gray Barker. "If I had believed for one moment that we were walking into danger, I would never have taken those children up that hill. But if someone had been hurt in a crash, waiting until morning might have been too late." The boys themselves handled the attention with varying degrees of comfort. Neil Nunley, as the oldest and most articulate of the group, often served as spokesperson for the others. He maintained consistently that they had told the truth about what they encountered, and refused to be swayed by those who suggested they had imagined or exaggerated the incident. "People can believe what they want," Neil told one reporter. "I know what I saw, and I know it wasn't any owl or any other normal animal. That thing was something that doesn't belong in these woods." Gene Lemon, as a volunteer firefighter and older teenager, faced particular scrutiny about his role in the incident. Some questioned why someone with emergency training hadn't attempted to get closer to the creature or investigate more thoroughly. "You have to understand," Gene explained. "When I saw that thing in the clearing, every instinct I had was telling me to get away from there as fast as possible. I've dealt with dangerous animals before, bears, wildcats, even aggressive dogs, but this was different." In the weeks following the initial encounter, several other residents of the Flatwoods area reported their own sightings of unusual phenomena. On September 19, just 1 week after the original incident, local farmer Bailey Fisher reported seeing strange lights moving through the trees on his property, the same property where the creature had been encountered. "I was out checking on my cattle around dusk," Fisher told Sheriff Carr, "when I saw these lights moving through the trees up on the hill. They weren't like any flashlights or lanterns I've ever seen. They were that same red color the May boy and his friends described, and they moved in ways that didn't seem natural." Fisher also reported that his cattle had been acting strangely since the night of September 12. "They won't go anywhere near the upper pasture," he explained. "Every time I try to drive them up there, they get spooked and run back down to the lower fields. And at night, they all cluster together as far from the hill as they can get." Similar reports came from based on documented events that occurred September 12, 1952. The evening of September 12, 1952, began like any other in the small town of Flatwoods, West Virginia. Nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, this community of fewer than 300 souls lived quietly among the rolling hills and dense forests that had sheltered their families for generations. The air carried the familiar scent of wood smoke and the earthy dampness of the approaching autumn, while the distant sound of Elk River whispered through the valley below. At the Braxton County schoolyard, a group of local boys had gathered for an impromptu game of football as the sun began its descent behind the tree line. Eddie May, 13, quarterbacked the makeshift team that included his younger brothers Freddie, 12, and Tommy, 10. Their friends Neil Nunley, 14, Ronnie Shaver, 10, and little Gary Stanek, 7, completed the group. The boys played with the carefree abandon that only comes with the end of summer, their laughter echoing across the small community. As darkness began to settle over the mountains at approximately 7:15 p.m., something extraordinary shattered the peaceful evening. A brilliant object streaked across the darkening sky, trailing fire and casting an otherworldly glow over the entire valley. The boys stopped their game mid-play, necks craned upward, mouths agape at the spectacle unfolding above them. "Did you see that?" Eddie shouted, his voice filled with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The object appeared to be moving from the southeast to the northwest, following a trajectory that would take it directly over the nearby hills. What made this sighting particularly unsettling was not just its brightness. Witnesses later described it as being brighter than any shooting star they had ever seen, but its controlled, purposeful movement. This was no random meteor burning up in the atmosphere. Neil Nunley, the oldest of the group and something of a leader among the local youth, watched as the object seemed to slow down as it approached a hill known locally as Fisher's Farm Hill. The elevation, part of the property owned by Bailey Fisher, rose about 400 feet above the surrounding valley and was covered in a thick canopy of oak, maple, and pine trees. "Boys, I think that thing just landed on Fisher's Hill," Neil announced, his voice carrying a mixture of excitement and uncertainty that would prove prophetic. The object appeared to settle behind the tree line, casting a strange, pulsing red glow that filtered through the forest canopy. Even from their distance of nearly a mile away, the boys could see this eerie illumination painting the hillside in shades of crimson that had no business existing in the natural world of rural West Virginia. Tommy May, the youngest of the three brothers, tugged on Eddie's sleeve. "What do you think it was?" Eddie, trying to maintain his authority as the eldest, replied with forced confidence, "Probably just a plane. Maybe it crashed." But even as he spoke the words, Eddie knew they didn't ring true. No plane he had ever seen moved like that, and certainly no conventional aircraft could produce such an otherworldly glow. The red light continued to pulse rhythmically through the trees, almost like a heartbeat, visible even as full darkness settled over the valley. Word of the strange sighting spread quickly through the small community. In a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, news traveled fast. Within minutes, several adults had stepped onto their porches to scan the sky and the distant hillside. Some reported seeing the same red glow filtering through the trees on Fisher's Hill, while others claimed to have witnessed the object's descent. Among those who heard the commotion was Kathleen May, a local woman known for her level-headedness and practical nature. A beautician by trade, Mrs. May was raising her three sons largely on her own and had developed a reputation for being both protective of her children and possessed of uncommon courage. When Eddie, Freddie, and Tommy burst through her front door, breathless with excitement and fear, she listened carefully to their account. "Mama, you should have seen it," Eddie exclaimed. "It was like a big ball of fire and it landed right up on Fisher's Hill. The whole hillside is glowing red." Mrs. May stepped onto her front porch and could indeed see the strange illumination emanating from the forested hillside. The red glow was unlike anything she had witnessed in her 32 years of life in these mountains. It wasn't the warm orange glow of a forest fire, nor was it the harsh white light of electric illumination. This was something else entirely, a deep, pulsing red that seemed to throb with malevolent life. The other boys soon arrived at the May household, each adding their own details to the account. Neil Nunley, always eager for adventure, was the first to voice what several of them were thinking. "Mrs. May, we should go up there and see what it is. Maybe someone needs help if it was a plane crash." Kathleen May felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the cool mountain air. Every maternal instinct told her to keep the children inside, to lock the doors, and to wait for morning before investigating anything. But the practical side of her mind acknowledged that if someone had indeed crashed on the hillside, time might be of critical importance. "If we're going to investigate, we're going together, and we're going prepared," she declared with the authority of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions. Mrs. May gathered supplies for the expedition with the methodical efficiency of a woman who had learned to be prepared for any eventuality. She retrieved a powerful flashlight from the kitchen drawer, a large, heavy model that her late husband had used for night work. She also collected a smaller backup light and made sure both had fresh batteries. "Neil, you run home and tell your mama where we're going," she instructed, "and see if she has a flashlight we can borrow." As Neil sprinted toward his house, Mrs. May turned to address the other boys who had gathered in her living room. Their faces were flushed with excitement, but she could see the underlying nervousness in their eyes. These were mountain children, raised on stories of the strange things that could happen in the deep woods after dark. "Boys, I want you to understand something," she said, her voice taking on the serious tone they all knew meant business. "If we do this, we stay together. No one wanders off, no one runs ahead, and if I say we turn back, we turn back. Is that understood?" A chorus of "yes, ma'am" filled the room. Neil returned shortly with Eugene Gene Lemon, a 17-year-old local boy who served as a volunteer firefighter with the Flatwoods Volunteer Fire Department. Gene was well respected in the community despite his youth, known for his level head and his experience dealing with emergencies in the rugged mountain terrain. "Mrs. May," Gene said, slightly out of breath from his quick jog, "Neil told me what you all saw. If there's been a crash up there, we should probably call the fire department." "That's good thinking, Gene, but the nearest phone that might reach the fire station is clear back in town. By the time we get word to them and they organize a search party, it could be hours. If someone's hurt up there." Gene nodded, understanding the logic. In the remote hills of 1950s West Virginia, self-reliance was often the only option. "Well then, I'll come with you. I've got experience with emergency situations, and I know that hill pretty well from hunting." The group now consisted of Mrs. May, Gene Lemon, and 6 boys ranging in age from 7 to 14. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. May made one final check of their supplies. In addition to the flashlights, she had gathered a first aid kit, some rope, and a thermos of hot coffee. Gene contributed a hunting knife and his own flashlight. "One more thing," Mrs. May announced. "We take the dog." The dog was Richie, a large German Shepherd mix that belonged to the May family. Richie was known throughout the community as a gentle giant with children, but also as an excellent watchdog with keen senses. If there was any kind of danger on the hillside, Richie would detect it long before any human could. The strange red glow was still visible through the trees as the group set out from the May house at approximately 8:00 p.m. The walk to the base of Fisher's Hill took them along a dirt road that wound through the valley, past several other homes where concerned residents had gathered on their porches to watch the mysterious light. "You folks be careful up there," called out Harold Braxton, an elderly farmer who lived near the base of the hill. "I've been watching that light for near an hour now, and it ain't natural. Seems to be moving around up there." His words sent a chill through the group, but they pressed on. The dirt road gradually gave way to a narrower path that led up the hillside through increasingly dense forest. The trees, mostly oak, maple, and pine, formed a thick canopy overhead, blocking out most of the starlight and creating a tunnel-like effect as they climbed. As they ascended, the red glow became more pronounced, filtering through the trees ahead of them with an intensity that seemed to wax and wane like a slow, rhythmic breathing. The effect was deeply unsettling, and Mrs. May noticed that Richie had begun to walk closer to the group, his ears pricked forward and his body tense with alertness. "How much further, Gene?" Tommy May asked, his voice smaller than it had been when they started. "Not too much further," Gene replied, though his own voice carried less confidence than usual. "The glow seems to be coming from the clearing up near the top of the hill. There's an old oak tree up there that we use as a landmark when hunting. If something landed, that's probably where it would be." The path continued to wind upward through the forest, and with each step, the red glow grew stronger. What was most unsettling about the light was its quality. It didn't behave like any artificial illumination they knew. Instead of casting steady shadows, it seemed to pulse and shift, causing the trees around them to appear to move and sway even when there was no wind. About halfway up the hill, Richie suddenly stopped and began to growl low in his throat. The sound was deep and menacing, unlike anything Mrs. May had heard from the normally gentle dog. His hackles rose, and he took a defensive stance, his body positioned between the group and whatever lay ahead in the darkness. "What is it, boy?" Mrs. May whispered, her hand instinctively reaching for the flashlight in her coat pocket. The dog continued to growl, his eyes fixed on something in the forest ahead that the humans couldn't yet see. The red glow seemed to pulse more rapidly now, almost as if responding to their presence. Gene motioned for the group to halt. As the volunteer firefighter, he had encountered his share of dangerous situations, and he recognized the signs of an animal or something that felt threatened. Maybe we should. He was cut off by a sound that would haunt the memories of everyone present for the rest of their lives. From somewhere ahead in the forest came a noise that defied easy description. It was part hiss, part screech, part mechanical whine, a sound that seemed to combine the worst elements of a steam engine under pressure, an enraged wildcat, and something altogether alien to the natural world of Appalachian West Virginia. The sound echoed through the forest for several seconds before fading into a silence that seemed somehow more ominous than the noise itself. Richie's growling intensified, and several of the younger boys instinctively moved closer to Mrs. May. "What in the Lord's name was that?" whispered Freddie May, his voice barely audible. Gene Lemon, despite his experience with emergency situations, felt his heart racing. In all his years hunting and hiking through these mountains, he had never heard anything remotely similar to that sound. "I don't know," he admitted, "but whatever made it, it's big." Mrs. May found herself faced with a decision that would define not only the rest of this evening, but potentially the rest of her life. Every instinct screamed at her to turn around, to lead the children back down the hillside to safety. But the practical part of her mind continued to insist that if someone had crashed, they might be in desperate need of help. "We go forward," she decided, her voice steady despite the fear she felt. "But we go slow and we go quiet. Gene, you take the lead with your light. Boys, stay close together behind me, and if I say run, you run back down that path as fast as you can." They resumed their ascent, moving much more cautiously now. The red glow ahead of them continued to pulse with that same rhythmic intensity, and as they drew closer, they began to notice another unsettling phenomenon. The forest around them had fallen completely silent. In the mountains of West Virginia, even on the quietest night, there are always sounds: the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the call of night birds, the whisper of wind through the trees. Now there was nothing but their own footsteps and the increasingly labored breathing of the group. "The animals," Neil Nunley observed in a hushed tone. "Where are all the animals?" It was an astute observation. They had seen no deer, heard no owls, encountered no raccoons or possums. Even the insects seemed to have abandoned this part of the forest. The only living creature they had encountered was their own dog, and Richie's behavior was becoming increasingly agitated with each step they took. As they rounded a bend in the path, Gene suddenly stopped and raised his hand for silence. Ahead of them, through a gap in the trees, they could see into a small clearing near the summit of the hill. The red glow was emanating from this clearing, and it was brighter and more intense than anything they had observed from the valley below. "There," Gene whispered, pointing toward the source of the illumination. "Whatever it is, it's right there." Mrs. May peered through the gap in the trees and felt her blood run cold. In the clearing stood what appeared to be some kind of craft or structure, roughly spherical in shape and glowing with that same pulsing red light. But that wasn't what made her gasp and instinctively reach for the children beside her. Standing near the craft, clearly visible in the red illumination, was a figure unlike anything she had ever seen or imagined. It stood approximately 10 feet tall, with a body that seemed to be covered in some kind of dark, metallic material. Where its face should have been was a large, luminous area that glowed with an orange-red light, like the front of a blast furnace. The creature's body appeared to be draped in some kind of dark, flowing material that extended from its torso and seemed to move independently of any wind. But perhaps most terrifying of all were its hands, or what passed for hands. They appeared to be long, claw-like appendages that hung at its sides, occasionally moving with a mechanical, deliberate motion that suggested both intelligence and malevolent intent. "Dear God in heaven," Mrs. May whispered, her voice barely audible even to herself. The creature seemed to be examining something near the craft, moving with a purposeful but alien gait that was neither fully mechanical nor fully organic. As the group watched in horrified fascination, the being suddenly stopped its examination and slowly turned in their direction. The orange-red glow that served as its face seemed to intensify as it oriented toward their hiding spot in the trees. For a moment that lasted an eternity, there was perfect silence. No sound from the creature, no movement from the humans, even Richie's growling had ceased. Then the creature tilted its head, or what they assumed was its head, in a motion that was unmistakably one of recognition. It had seen them. What happened next would be seared into the memories of all present for the rest of their lives. The creature raised one of its claw-like appendages and pointed directly at their location. As it did so, it emitted that same horrific sound they had heard earlier, the hissing, screeching, mechanical whine that seemed to combine the worst elements of animal rage and mechanical malfunction. But this time, the sound was accompanied by something even more terrifying. A smell began to waft toward them through the forest air, a noxious, sulfurous odor that was unlike anything in their experience. It was the smell of something burning, something metallic, something fundamentally wrong. Gene Lemon, trained to face dangerous situations, found himself paralyzed by fear. The beam of his flashlight wavered as his hands began to shake, and when he tried to speak, only a choked whisper emerged. "We need to leave. Now." Mrs. May needed no further encouragement. "Run," she commanded, her voice cutting through the terror that had gripped the group. "Run back to the path, now." What followed was a mad scramble down the hillside that would later be remembered by all participants as the longest and most terrifying minutes of their lives. Led by Mrs. May and Gene Lemon, the group crashed through the underbrush with no thought for stealth or caution, only an overwhelming need to put distance between themselves and whatever they had encountered in that clearing. Behind them, the creature's horrible sound continued, growing even louder and more intense. But worse than the noise was the fact that it seemed to be following them. The red glow that emanated from the hilltop began to move, shifting through the trees in a way that suggested the creature, or its craft, or both, was giving chase. Richie, the German shepherd who had shown such courage in approaching the hillside, was now leading the retreat, his powerful legs carrying him down the mountain path faster than his human companions could follow. His animal instincts had clearly identified whatever they had encountered as a threat beyond anything in his experience. "Don't look back," Mrs. May shouted to the boys as they stumbled and ran through the darkness. "Just keep moving." But it was impossible not to look back. The red glow was definitely pursuing them, moving through the forest with a speed and agility that suggested it was not bound by the same physical limitations that hampered the fleeing humans. Trees that should have blocked its path seemed to present no obstacle, and the light maintained a steady pace that kept it in sight but never quite caught up. Young Gary Stanek, at only 7 years old, was having the most difficulty keeping up with the group's desperate pace. Gene Lemon, despite his own terror, scooped up the boy and continued running with him in his arms. "I've got you, Gary," he panted. "Just hang on." As they reached the halfway point down the hillside, Neil Nunley stumbled and fell, his flashlight spinning away into the underbrush. Eddie May, despite his own fear, stopped to help his friend to his feet. As he did so, he made the mistake of looking back up the hill. "It's still coming," he gasped, "and it's getting closer." The red glow was indeed closer now, perhaps only a few hundred yards behind them. But what was even more terrifying was that the horrible sound had changed. Instead of the mechanical hissing they had heard before, the creature was now emitting a series of shorter, sharper sounds, almost like a hunting call. "It's hunting us," Mrs. May realized with a chill that went deeper than fear. In all her years in these mountains, she had encountered bears, wildcats, and even the occasional dangerous human. But this was something entirely different, something that viewed them not as fellow inhabitants of the earth, but as prey to be stalked. The group reached the bottom of the hill and the dirt road at approximately 8:45 p.m., having covered the distance down in less than half the time it had taken them to ascend. They paused only long enough to make sure everyone was accounted for before continuing their flight toward the center of town. Behind them, the red glow had stopped at the edge of the forest, pulsing with that same rhythmic intensity they had observed from the valley. But it came no further, as if whatever controlled it was unwilling or unable to leave the cover of the trees. "Is everyone all right?" Mrs. May asked, her voice shaky with adrenaline and fear. A quick headcount revealed that all 6 boys, Gene Lemon, and even Richie had made it safely down the mountain. But while they were physically unharmed, the psychological impact of what they had experienced was evident in their faces: wide eyes, pale complexion, and the kind of trembling that comes from an encounter with something beyond normal human experience. "What was that thing?" Tommy May asked, his voice small and frightened. No one had an answer. The group made their way directly to the office of A. Lee Stewart, Jr., the editor and co-publisher of the Braxton Democrat, the local newspaper. Stewart lived above his office in the center of Flatwoods, and despite the late hour, they knew he would want to hear their account immediately. When Stewart opened his door to find 8 people on his doorstep, all of them clearly shaken and several of the children still trembling, he immediately invited them inside. As a newspaperman, he had developed an instinct for recognizing when something significant had occurred, and the demeanor of this group, particularly the inclusion of the normally composed Kathleen May and the reliable Gene Lemon, told him this was not a case of overactive imagination. "Now then," Stewart said, settling the group in his office and pouring coffee for the adults, "suppose you tell me exactly what happened up there." Mrs. May, as the adult leader of the expedition, took the lead in recounting their experience. Stewart listened without interruption as she described the initial sighting, the decision to investigate, the ascent up Fisher's Hill, and finally, the terrifying encounter in the clearing. When she finished, Stewart turned to Gene Lemon. "Gene, you're a firefighter. You've seen your share of unusual situations. What's your assessment of what you encountered?" Gene was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Mr. Stewart, in all my years of emergency work, I've never encountered anything remotely like what we saw up there. That wasn't any kind of aircraft I'm familiar with, and that creature wasn't any animal I've ever heard of. I can't explain it, but I know what I saw." One by one, Stewart interviewed each member of the group, taking careful notes of their accounts. What impressed him was the consistency of their stories. While minor details varied, as would be expected from witnesses of different ages and perspectives, the core elements remained the same across all accounts: the strange craft, the 10-foot-tall creature with the glowing face, the horrible sound, and the sulfurous smell. "Boys," Stewart said finally, "I want you to know that what you've told me is going to be in the newspaper. People are going to read about this, and some of them might not believe you. Are you prepared for that?" The boys looked at each other uncertainly. In their small community, being the subject of disbelief or ridicule was a serious concern. But Neil Nunley, ever the leader among them, spoke for the group. "Mr. Stewart, we know what we saw. Whether people believe us or not doesn't change what happened up there." Stewart nodded approvingly. "That's the right attitude. Now, I think we should contact the authorities. The county sheriff should be notified, and possibly the state police." As Stewart reached for his telephone, Mrs. May raised a concern that had been bothering her since their flight down the mountain. "Mr. Stewart, that thing, whatever it was, it seemed to be hunting us. What if it comes down into town? What if it goes after other people?" It was a chilling thought that had occurred to Stewart as well. If the creature they described was real and potentially dangerous, the entire community could be at risk. "I'll call Sheriff Carr immediately," he decided, "and I think we should organize some kind of watch for tonight, just in case." Within an hour, Sheriff Robert Carr arrived at Stewart's office, along with Deputy Sheriff Burnell Long. Both men listened carefully to the accounts provided by the witnesses, and like Stewart, they were impressed by the consistency of the stories and the credibility of the witnesses. "Mrs. May," Sheriff Carr said, "you understand that this is a pretty extraordinary claim you're making. A 10-foot-tall creature with a glowing face." "Sheriff, I understand how it sounds," Mrs. May replied. "But I know what I saw, and more importantly, I know the character of these children. They're not in the habit of making up stories, especially not stories that would bring this kind of attention to themselves." Sheriff Carr had to admit that was true. The May boys were well regarded in the community, as were Neil Nunley and the other children, and Jean Lemon's participation lent additional credibility to the account. "All right," the sheriff decided. "Deputy Long and I will organize a search party for first light tomorrow. We'll go up to Fisher's Hill and see what we can find. In the meantime, I want everyone to stay indoors after dark, and if anyone sees anything unusual, they're to contact my office immediately." Dawn on September 13, 1952, broke gray and overcast over the mountains of Braxton County. Sheriff Carr had assembled a search party consisting of himself, Deputy Long, several volunteers from the fire department, and A. Lee Stewart, who insisted on accompanying the group in his capacity as a journalist. The red glow that had been visible through the trees the night before was gone, leaving Fisher's Hill looking like any other forested slope in the Appalachian Mountains. But as the search party made their way up the same path the witnesses had taken the evening before, they immediately noticed something unusual about the forest. "Sheriff," called out one of the volunteer firefighters, "you need to see this." The man was pointing to several large trees along the path that showed signs of severe damage. The bark had been stripped away in long, parallel gouges that suggested something with enormous claws had scraped against them. The gouges were too high off the ground to have been made by any known animal in the region, and they were too deep and too precisely parallel to have been caused by natural weathering or falling branches. "What kind of animal could make marks like that?" Deputy Long asked, examining the damaged bark. "No animal I know of," Sheriff Carr replied grimly. "These gouges go up at least 12 feet off the ground. Even a bear rearing up on its hind legs couldn't reach that high." As they continued up the hill, they found more evidence of something large and powerful having moved through the forest. Branches were broken at heights that would have required considerable force to achieve, and in several places, the underbrush had been flattened in a pattern that suggested something very heavy had passed through. When they reached the clearing near the summit where the witnesses claimed to have seen the creature and its craft, the search party found additional disturbing evidence. The grass in the clearing had been flattened in a roughly circular pattern approximately 20 feet in diameter. Within this circle, the vegetation was not just flattened but appeared to have been burned or withered, taking on a blackened, lifeless appearance that was completely at odds with the healthy green grass surrounding it. "Look at this," Stewart called out, pointing to several impressions in the soft earth at the edge of the burned area. "These look like footprints." The impressions were unlike anything any of the searchers had seen before. They were roughly triangular in shape, approximately 18 inches long and 12 inches wide at the base, with what appeared to be 3 distinct toe or claw marks at the front of each print. The impressions were deep, suggesting whatever had made them was extremely heavy. Sheriff Carr knelt down to examine the prints more closely. "These tracks are at least 2 inches deep in this soil," he observed. "Whatever made them had to weigh several hundred pounds at minimum." But perhaps most disturbing of all was the smell that still lingered in the clearing. The sulphurous, metallic odor the witnesses had described the night before remained, though it was much fainter now. It was an unpleasant smell that seemed to cling to the back of the throat and was unlike anything any of the searchers could identify. "That smell," Deputy Long said, wrinkling his nose. "I've never encountered anything like it. It's almost like burning metal but with something organic mixed in." As the search party continued to document the evidence they had found, A. Lee Stewart was taking careful notes and photographs. As a journalist, he understood the importance of documenting everything thoroughly, but as a resident of these mountains, he was deeply unsettled by what they were discovering. "Sheriff," Stewart said, "I think we need to contact the state authorities. This is beyond anything our local resources can handle." Sheriff Carr nodded in agreement. The evidence they were finding corroborated the witnesses' accounts in ways that made it impossible to dismiss their story